Hello, and thanks for tuning in for another session of Reading with Me. In this short video, I'd like to review selections from the text Gaudium et Spes, which was written and issued by the Second Vatican Council. It dates from 1965. We'll look at selections as they're relevant particularly to theories of salvation and the schools of thought that we've been studying. The opening of the text is quite remarkable. The joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the men of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. There's a real sense of unity here, that anything which is genuinely human, the things which affect us after the fall, the bad parts of being human, and the things which are genuinely good, the things which come from our creation, all of these things are shared by Christians and non-Christians alike. Indeed, the Vatican Council continues, nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in their hearts. This is why this community realizes that it is truly linked with mankind and its history by the deepest of bonds. There's a certain sense of Catholic theology which is always universal, meaning that it appeals to all humans, or it makes claims about all humans, claims about human nature. And I think the opening of this text, Gaudium et Spes, really does focus on that universal sense of Catholic theology. And that's, one kind of a claim about the scope of Catholic theology. It ought to be relevant to everyone else. But two, it's a challenge, and particularly a challenge to the modern Catholic theologian, that however she articulates the faith, it's got to be with an eye towards being universally relevant. Well, for our reading, I'd like to skip ahead to section 7, and you see I've got a workbook already prepared with just the selections recommended for this study. But if you've got access to the text anywhere else, you can flip through to paragraphs 7 and 8. There's a note that in the modern context in particular, there's been a change in attitudes in human structures, and that calls into question accepted values. There's a sense in which in every generation, we have to think about what our beliefs, what our rationality, what our desires mean. And so there's a work, in essence, of translating the previous generations into the present. And Gaudium et Spes is attempting to do something like this, to act as a pivot point, perhaps not so much to change the content or the meaning, but to make what was meaningful or relevant or articulated in the past now able to be articulated as deeply meaningfully in the current context. So Vatican II spends some time outlining some of the different extremes into which people fall, or some of the different ways that people feel or recognize themselves. Right. The development comes rapidly, and that often leads to disorder. And we know this in our own life, that when there's lots of change, especially lots of change happening quickly, then we find ourselves imbalanced and struggling. This can lead us to question not only the world around us or the meaning and the stories that our elders give us, but also ourselves. And when we face these kinds of conflicts, hardships, we find ourselves in a land, really a world of mutual distrust and enmities. Now, the universal relevant part here, I think, from the Second Vatican Council is that all of us are at once the cause and the victim of these kinds of atrocities. We tend often to think that we cannot hold these together, right? That I'm only the victim or I'm only the cause. As we mature, I think we realize, more and more that there are parts of our lives which are out of our control and parts which are in control. But at any one time, how I experience myself today or how I experience the world might not simply be like a them or outside versus me or inside, but that some of the things I was doing yesterday might actually have an impact on me today. And so I can be the cause of something and the victim of it. Or if we think about it in another kind of image, it's like the things that I do come back to me. And we say often, what goes around comes around. I think Vatican II is expressing something like that and saying that we're both the cause and the victim. But we know as theologians, part of what lies behind this language of cause and victim is what we call the free will defense against the problem of evil, that God is not the cause of our problem, but rather we are. And that doesn't mean that we have to find a particular person who's the cause of my struggle. It doesn't have to be only me or only my neighbor. There can be a large sort of structural element to the evil, the conflict, the hardship, the enmity, to mutual distrust. I think the point here in section 8 from Gaudium et Spes is that we alone are responsible for evil. We're the ones who bring this about on ourselves. And so we have to first look at ourselves when we want to figure out why things are wrong. Another way that this gets articulated in Vatican II, and I find this particularly helpful, is in section 10. And that is to think that this basic imbalance is rooted in our own hearts. The being both a cause and a victim, the being mixed in our motives and sometimes mixed in our abilities and mixed in our results. Well, this kind of imbalance is rooted in the heart of man. We think also the scriptural language here of like two spirits at war within ourselves, or wanting one thing and wanting its opposite. This has long been an observation among the philosophers. Plato is addressing this kind of thing and trying to figure out what to make of it. Paul certainly makes mention of it and puzzles over it. Augustine deeply investigated this imbalance and argued that grace really helps to heal us. Well, Gaudium et Spes, thinking about the joys and the hopes of our generation, as well as its fears and its distresses, notes that we're imbalanced and says that imbalance is in society, but it's also in each individual person. It's rooted in our hearts. I think that does adequately describe a vast majority of what we feel, right? We don't ever feel pure one way or another, not purely evil, not purely good. We feel kind of out of balance, limping, not getting everything that we want out of life. All right, well, I have flagged a few things in section 11 that I think are relevant to our understanding of how different theologians envision salvation. Section 11 reads at the beginning, "The people of God believes that it is led by the Lord's Spirit who fills the earth, and motivated by this faith, it labors to decipher authentic signs of God's presence and purpose in the happenings, needs, and desires in which this people has a part, along with other men of our age." We might ask, what is it that we're doing as Christians, or how does this play out? And here in Vatican II, we get this idea that the real labor of the church, the real action of being a Christian, is to decipher the signs, to read the signs, to be a prophet. And people talk like this often, God gave me a sign, or maybe they ask God, give me a sign. And then we wonder, but is it authentic? Is it genuine? How will I know? I spend time in prayer. Do I consult scripture? Do I go talk to some sage somewhere? What are the tools by which we decipher whether these signs are authentic or not? But the basic question, the basic work of being Christian is the prophetic work of attempting to decipher the signs, to figure out where God is present and what that means for us. Right, so Vatican II is articulating, like we get it. This age is particularly fraught with tension. We've got a lot of things going on. But if we take a step back and think about it, tension and imbalance in life is not new. Maybe the way it shows up or the way we think about it these days is slightly different from how we have thought about it or how it showed up in the past. But it's not new for humans to find themselves out of balance, struggling, or swinging back and forth between joys and hopes and despairs and terrors. And the work of the people of God, the work of the Christian church, is is really right there to figure out which of this is authentically God and which of this is not. And we've already seen that Gaudium et Spes is, in essence, opening up a couple of possibilities. Something could be from God. It could be a genuine sign from God. It could be from our own brokenheartedness or imbalanced heart. And it could be from the world out there. So we could be the cause, we could be the victim, or we could be thinking about goodness from God. Now, this first chapter, they call it, after the sort of prologue or introductory material, it starts with section 12. This is really key for thinking about what it means to be human, and particularly how we would frame a discussion about the dignity of the human person, or we might think about the worth of the human person. I think that Gaudium et Spes is helpful here. We're often tempted to think of dignity in terms of rights, and that's very helpful language in a lot of conversations. Vatican II, in essence, is telling the story differently, or showing us that there's another way to think about our human dignity. And that dignity is really rooted in our creation in the image of God. And so if you want to ask the question, what does it mean to be human? Or why is a human dignified? Then the Christian response is, well, because humans are made by God. And not just that we're made by God, but we're made by God in such a way as to be the image of God. And that means to be capable of knowing and loving. Knowing and loving our Creator, right? But also knowing and loving other humans, and in as much as it's possible, knowing and loving other creatures, our pets and our garden, and these things around us that God has given to us for our comfort and for our care. But we do not experience all of this as good, and some of it even attacks us and comes at us in a problematic way. All right, so we have doubt and anxiety, and that doubt and anxiety is a real part of human history. So we have to ask, whence the doubt? Whence the problems? And Vatican II steers us towards the basic story, the basic understanding of humanity presented in Genesis 1, 2, and 3 here. From the very onset of our history, we have abused our liberty at the urging of the evil one. Well, we know this. This is the doctrine of original sin. This is the story which is presented in Genesis 3. So this is quite familiar language to us. But if we've been paying careful attention to kind of the options that Vatican II is laying out, the joys and the hopes, the fears, the terrors, the anxieties, the doubts, all these things, where do they come from? What are their origins? And we've said early on, it looks like, well, some might be from God, and some might be from ourselves, and some might be from other humans. We might be victims, we might be causes. We'll add the evil one, the devil, Satan in there as another kind of cause for evil in the world. I don't think this is meant to compete with our role, the human role in bringing evil about, but just to note that there are evil forces which are more powerful than simple human agency. And if we want to truly address that kind of evil, then we need an agency which is also greater than human agency, but for the good. That, of course, is why Christians rely on Christ, because Christ is, in the end, more powerful than the evil one. All right, so from the beginning, we set ourselves against God, and we sought to attain our goal apart from God. That's the basic sense of pride, right? That we chose ourselves over someone else, over God, and wrongly so, right? It wasn't like we recognized our own dignity rooted in God, creating us, making us His image, but instead we tried to make ourselves in another image, in the image of the evil one, in the image of some false vision of ourselves. We took matter into our own hands when we should not have. And so we set our goal, we determined our goal for ourselves apart from God. And even though we knew God, we did not glorify Him. We turned back on Him. We did not recognize God as our God. And so we fell. We turned away. And this means we were darkened, and that we end up severing parts of our relationship with God. We damage them. And Genesis 3 tells us the result of that is that we hide. We hide from God, and we hide with everyone else. Now, this is one of the best lines perhaps in Gaudium et Spes. What divine revelation makes known to us agrees with experience. There's a fairly well-known quote, I think attributed to a few people, that original sin is the only empirically verifiable doctrine. In other words, if you ever find yourself wondering what we're talking about with original sin, we just have to look outside the door, and you'll certainly see some people who are less than ideal. And more to the point, you need to look in your own heart, and you find there that you have inclinations towards evil too. Now, at this point, I think we might meet some objections. I mean, obviously, there would be people who might want to object to God from the very beginning, or appealing to Scripture to make an explanation for human existence. But here, I think you might find some people do not think that they're inclined to evil. They might think that some people are purely innocent. And the Catholic truth, the Catholic truth does not agree. The Catholic truth thinks that everyone encounters himself or herself broken, that everyone finds himself or herself imbalanced, at least in one way, if not in multiple. And in that sense, we really do face the question, why do I encounter myself already as broken? That seems very unfair, and how is that compatible with a good God? All right, so these ills cannot come from the good Creator, but the fact that we do encounter those ills, well, that helps explain why there's so much doubt and anxiety. Now, the theological explanation, of course, is that we have abused our liberty, that we have brought evil into the world. I think Vatican II is pointing out the problem is real, and we have some sense of an explanation for it. Refusing to acknowledge God at our beginning, we have disrupted also our proper relationship to our own ultimate goal, as well as our whole relationship towards God and others and all created things. And therefore, man is split within himself. If you're asking, do I agree at this point, I think you have to stop and be honest, right? Do you find yourself split within yourself? Do you find yourself sometimes wanting things which are good and sometimes wanting things which are not? Now, obviously, Vatican II thinks, yes, you will, and this is a very Augustinian reflection on what it means to be human, particularly to live on this side of the fall, to live outside the garden. All right, presuming you agree, or at least you understand what the Second Vatican Council is discussing here, as a result, all of human life, whether individual or collective, shows itself to be a dramatic struggle between good and evil. And again, the role of the Church is to help discern what's authentically good, and then to help redeem in the face of evil. Indeed, man finds that by himself he is incapable of battling the assaults of evil successfully. Well, just a minute ago, we were speaking about the urging of the evil one, about an evil power which is greater than human power, and that brings up the need for human reliance upon God's power. When we think about that in terms of our sort of classical schools of thought for theories of salvation, we realize that this is really articulating human insufficiency. And this is a pretty standard thought pattern, right? There is original sin. We messed it up. That's part of the free will defense against the problem of evil. But it also explains how we got to where we are. And because of original sin, we are insufficient. We cannot save ourselves. We cannot get to heaven, our own goal. We are broken. And that comes across here, even in a section on the dignity of the human person. The argument is that the dignity of the human person lies even before original sin. It lies in our creation in the image of God. You have to go all the way back to the beginning with Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 to see our dignity. It's only in Genesis 3 that we meet original sin and develop that real sense of human insufficiency and human need for grace. All right, if you didn't catch it earlier, I think we're talking about original sin as a kind of cause. It's the wound of sin, in essence, which causes us to experience ourselves as rebellious. So because we have sinned in the past, we struggle in the future. Because Adam and Eve sinned in the past, we encounter ourselves as broken right now in the present. All right, well, this is a pretty standard analysis in sort of the history of Christian thought about where we fit. And that might make us be tempted to think that, we're so broken that we're less than other animals. Dogs don't seem to be that broken. They don't have these huge personality disorders that we do, all these fears and anxieties. And yet, the original creation stories, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, tell us that we are superior to the rest of the creatures. And in fact, there's a part of us which is higher than simple bodily concerns. And so Vatican II articulates that, man is not wrong when he regards himself as superior to bodily concerns. There's more to being human than just the bodily parts. And that more, would be our intellect. And it's by virtue of our intellectual abilities, our reason, our ability to think through things, that we would surpass simply the material universe. Of course, we think of something like a rock as being perfectly material, right? And so we're talking now about this broader category, the diversity in creation. Why are there different things in the world, and are they ranked or ordered? And Vatican II is holding that traditional Christian position that there are in fact different things in the world. You need more than one story to explain our universe. You need material causes and immaterial causes, and humans include both. Humans have matter and we have intellect, which would be different from matter. And that makes us high on the scale of being, or on the scale of things. All right, so another reason that humanity is dignified is because we're created with these different kinds of, what do you want to call them, parts or faculties or aspects to our existence. That makes us different from other things in creation. And furthermore, that diversity is good. This belongs to our dignity. Moving along to section 16, the result of this connection to God, of this being created good, and having an intellect, a reason, an ability to think through things, means that we have a conscience. And that conscience is really part of our reason, by which, or through which, in which we detect a law which we do not impose upon ourselves, but which still holds us to obey. And that law summons us to love good and avoid evil. Now again, the Catholic theology is saying that it's relevant, it's universal theology. So the underlying point here is that all humans have some kind of conscience. All humans know that there's a sort of moral law in the universe which bids us to love the good and to avoid the evil. This is a universal claim about all of humanity, not simply about Christians. Though, of course, Christians have the bonus, the reassurance of revelation and tradition to help remind us that we do in fact have a conscience, and it does in fact say love good and avoid evil, even if we sometimes get confused about that. All right, so part of being immaterial, part of having an intellect, part of being human is to have a conscience, and that conscience tells us all, love good, avoid evil. Now, in thinking through these sort of experiential elements, the phenomenon of being human, Vatican II, in section 17 of Gaudium et Spes, mentions this pretty common threefold analysis of human existence. Man's dignity demands that he act according to a knowing and free choice that is personally motivated and prompted from within, not utter blind impulse, nor by mere external pressure. There's a lot going on in this sentence. We diagram it in a number of other texts and videos, but we'll call attention here to two different things that we see in the background. One, this triad of acting, knowing, and choosing. That's the Augustinian reflection, right? And remember, Augustine has the basic three categories: know, will, and act. Now, the Augustinian meditation is often, what are the consequences of original sin? Can you know the good always, or are you sometimes puzzled over it? And Augustine says your mind is broken. You do not always know the good, or you do not reliably know the good. Even if you do know it, will you always choose it? Does your will want the good always? And Augustine says, no, you're broken in your mind and in your will. And then even if you know the good and you choose it, you want to be better, are you always able to enact that? And of course, the Augustinian school of thought says no, sometimes there are other limiting factors. Right, so Vatican II is using that well-known triad there to describe human existence, which we find in Augustine for sure. But we're also thinking about a kind of theory of what it means to be human, or how a human acts. And when we think about that, we're getting into the realm of virtue here. But notice that we separate impulse and external pressure. And so if we wanted to think of what makes a perfectly human act, we might be asking, like, if you're forced to do something under compulsion, is that a truly human act? And, well, Vatican II is saying no. Now, the reality is that often happens, right? We are compelled by external pressures, by needs, and maybe even sometimes just someone else really pushing us, like peer pressure or something. And that mitigates, works against our freedom. It makes the act less ours or less human. And that's part of what's going on here. And similarly, we have these internal impulses. And those impulses often present themselves to us with a kind of, you feel this, do that, right? You're angry, punch that person. And the basic idea here is neither those impulses nor those external pressures fully define us. In fact, in a way, we need to separate ourselves from them, because we have an impulse, and it says act, do something, but we have to think about it and know what the right thing to do is, and we have to choose it freely. And if external pressure mitigates our choice, or the impulse overrides our knowledge or our choice, then, well, we're not acting freely, and that's not in our full dignity. To put it another way, if we think of ourselves, interacting with other humans, well, we certainly should not simply take advantage of their internal impulses or offer too much external pressure in such a way that we prevent them from knowing the truth or prevent them from being free. So there's a very dense kind of set of background concerns going on here. I think we're dealing with the Augustinian triad about acting, knowing, and choosing, but we're also dealing with a picture of virtue and human action in which we have to account for internal impulses, external pressures, and then still find a way to think about it and choose it and then act all on our own. And to do so is to achieve dignity, to live into your full dignity as a human. Man achieves such dignity, Vatican II says, when emancipating himself from all captivity to passion, he pursues his goal in a spontaneous choice of what is good, and procures for himself, through effective and skillful action, apt helps to that end. All right, so the fullness of human dignity is going to be when we're free, essentially, to love the good in the truth, and when we're free to avoid evil in the truth. But, classic Augustinian position here, since our freedom has been damaged by sin, it's only by the aid of God's grace that we can get into that fully human, fully dignified state. And so here we see a teaching about the necessity of grace. Now, this is quite traditional Augustinian presentation of the material, right? There's an all-good God. He created us. We contributed to our downfall, so original sin is our own fault and a cause of what comes in the future. That means we are not sufficient to attain salvation, for sure. We're not sufficient to get ourselves complete on the right path, and so grace is necessary. All right, we get, death. Well, that's the consequences of sin. We get the redemption of death, that somehow it's through death that we can experience resurrection and get to heaven. And then we're reminded in section 19 of Gaudium et Spes that the root reason for human dignity lies in man's call to communion with God. Again, if we're to go back and think about that presentation of what it means to be human, or of a fully human action, or of the full dignity of humanity in the earlier section 17 of this same text, then it's saying, the root of our dignity lies in communion with God. And in order to have good communion with God, appropriate communion with God, to love good and avoid evil, well, we need to be free and we need to be knowledgeable so that we can genuinely act in communion with God. And that means that we have to judge our impulses and decide whether we want to act on them or not. And it means we have to judge the outside pressures and decide also for ourselves whether we want to act on those or not. Right, underneath that, that our real dignity lies in a call to commune with God, Vatican II wants to address those who would not express it that way, right? Who would think of themselves as atheist, or at least those who would be concerned with the atheist objection. And it's helpful here to separate different kinds of atheism, right? So some are atheist because they've thought a lot about it, and they cannot find a way to understand God. They see science and reason as showing that God does not exist or being incompatible with God. But others never get that part, right? They don't come at it from a sort of rational problem. They raise questions from God in other ways. Perhaps, Vatican II says, well, they just simply don't experience religious stirrings, or they don't see why it would be relevant to them. And that would be a different kind of objection than, seeing that it might be relevant, but having an argument that it's not. And as perhaps a third sensibility for why someone might be atheist, Vatican II says, atheism results not rarely from a violent protest against the evil in this world. And we might add that today, the evil in the church. It's no small secret that many prominent Christians, or at least those calling themselves Christians, have been responsible for grave evils and really atrocious sins. All right, so Vatican II is saying, atheism has a lot going for it. It's not entirely clear how you can hold all things together. It's an admission, I think, from Vatican II that doubt is also reasonable in a certain sense. Now, that's not going to say that everyone should doubt. I mean, obviously, Vatican II thinks that theism is the right answer, but Vatican II recognizes that atheism is compelling in a lot of situations. And then Vatican II goes a step further, I think, in recognizing that atheism is often related to an understanding of freedom or liberty, and that many might understand atheism as a way of maintaining freedom. It's like, doesn't God limit our freedom, or wouldn't it be somehow binding, closing us in, if we committed ourselves to a religion or committed ourselves to a church? Doesn't Catholicism somehow close down our freedom? Right, so Vatican II is raising these objections, and these are objections they're considering in the 1960s, but I think they're still quite relevant to today. How we envision freedom, how we envision the problem of evil. These are all very deep motivations for thinking that atheism might have something going for it. Right, once the problem has been stated, we start to get the sketch of a solution to it. And Vatican II says, Gaudium et Spes, section 21, the Church holds that the recognition of God is in no way hostile to man's dignity, since this dignity is rooted and perfected in God. Right? If you were thinking of human independence in that modern atheistic way, where it was somehow closed by God, Vatican II is saying we have a different understanding of freedom. Freedom is liberated by God, or as Augustine says, the free will is held captive, and so you need grace to liberate free will. In other words, I think Gaudium et Spes is making a very Augustinian argument in section 21 here. We're aware of the objections, but we think some of them are framed in a different paradigm, because the Catholic paradigm is that believing in God, accepting God, acknowledging God, and having grace work in your life is in no way hostile to man's dignity, since this dignity is rooted and perfected in God. The goal is that ultimate joy or bliss that we find in union with God. Man was made an intelligent and free member of society by God who created him. But even more important, we are called as sons and daughters to commune with God and to share in God's happiness. She, that is the Church, further teaches that a hope related to the end of time does not diminish the importance of intervening duties, but rather undergirds the acquittal of them with fresh incentives. So, Christians are hopeful for heaven. And, well, the modern atheist might say, look, if you're hopeful for heaven, then doesn't that diminish the sense in which you have to take care of the here and now? Just sort of, whatever, who cares? We're going to go to heaven in the end eventually. Or this world is not important or this body is not important. And Vatican II is saying quite the contrary. To hope in the kind of redemption that's at the heart of Christianity means that you have to work all the harder for all of these other intervening duties, taking care of the sick and the poor, and being with people through thick and thin, through good and bad. That is actually part of the Christian vision of salvation. All right, so Vatican II is saying we want to try to paint a picture of Christianity which is not hostile to our dignity, which does not remove our freedom or impinge it, nor do we want the hope for salvation to somehow mean that we can ignore all of the problems that we see around us in this world. That's a pretty bold statement. All right, well, that boldness ends, as we would expect for Christians, in recognition of the incarnation. The truth is that only in the mystery of the incarnate Word does the mystery of man take on light. And here we get the beautiful imagery. It comes from Paul, but it's very traditional in all of Christian theology. We think of Adam as the first man, and Adam presents to us a figure, a type, a looking forward of the second man, of Christ, him who was to come. And Christ then is the second Adam and shows us what the fullness of human existence looks like. So if the first Adam shows us that we are created good, but we break ourselves in the fall, then the second Adam, Christ, shows us that our redemption does not simply return us to the garden, but it elevates us all the way to heaven. It brings us into the mystery of the Father and His love. It brings us into the mystery of the Trinity. Right? So the arc of salvation, or the horizon of our hope, is even broader now. And that's a universal hope, according to Gaudium et Spes, that we ought to be able to have a conversation with any human being about what lies genuinely at the heart of our existence, and to show that the incarnation, the self-gift of the Son in coming to us in human form and being just like us in everything except sin, that's meaningful. That's meaningful to everyone. It shows something about our own nature which we long to fulfill, and we know can only be fulfilled in Christ. Right, well, this is a very Augustinian presentation of salvation, of what Christian salvation is about. It's about a kind of transformation from within. Grace works to free our broken and captive free will. Grace works to heal our knowledge. Grace works to make it possible for us to be able to act so that we can be fully human and fully dignified. But it doesn't stop there. It's not just that we're going to be fully human as though that only has relevance on earth in this physical life, but also that to be fully human means to enter a relationship with the Trinity and to make it into heaven. All right, well, that concludes the little selections from Vatican II up to paragraph 22 or section 22 of Gaudium et Spes. And so if you're following along in the workbook, it probably ends something like this. Since Christ died for all, this is a universal claim, and since the ultimate vocation of man is in fact one and divine, we ought to believe that the Holy Spirit, in a manner known only to God, offers to every man the possibility of being associated with this paschal mystery, with the saving death and resurrection of our Lord. Such is the mystery of man, and it is a great one, as seen by believers in the light of Christian revelation. We ought to be able to have a conversation with any human about what's truly meaningful, and that means that we have to unpack what's problematic and what's broken and get to the more profound good, which lies even earlier than the perversion of that good. And from that place, we can make sense of Christ and the meaning of Christianity. And that's a very Augustinian and Catholic presentation of salvation.